Hi, I'm Michelle Fenton, and welcome to the Happitecture Podcast. What would it take to develop resilient, sustainable communities? How do we design cities that support our collective happiness? Join me as my guests and I discuss how we can plan, implement, and foster places that allow us to flourish and grow. Dr. Glover, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast today and to talk about something that I've always been truly excited about, the transformative power of the built environment to create a more just and joyful and connected community. In fact, this conversation, I think, is one of the main reasons I started the podcast in the first place, is so that we can have this dialogue out in the open and have our guests engage in conversations about an environment that impacts them in so many ways that they might not even recognize or realize, but that it gives our guests an opportunity to understand how they can actually take agency for the built environment, because we don't always get a say in, the parks that we occupy and the gathering spaces. These are usually typically designed from top down. And so to be able to have dialogues like this is truly an honor and a privilege. And I hope that our guests get something really tremendous out of it. So I really appreciate your time here with us today. Your research, I think about it, we were talking just before we started recording how if we had connected when I was doing my thesis at the University of Waterloo, I think my thesis would have been richer for it. And so I feel like this conversation was a long time coming. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very flattered to be here.
Well, let's get into it. Your research focuses on transformative placemaking and the reshaping, re-territorializing, and remaking of community spaces. And you've explored how people develop attachments to place and how social capital, the relationships and resources built through community spaces can really enhance the quality of life. In fact, one of your most recent research talks specifically about how the built environment can actually help healing patients who are going through cancer treatments. And, you're very specific about it. And so it's incredible work. I just wanted to ask you the first opening question. What do you see as the most powerful way that placemaking can shape social structures and improve community well-being? Because that's such a big topic right now, especially when we are coming out of, we've been out of COVID for a bit, but especially when COVID really brought to our attention the impact of loneliness and the impact of lack of community, and even before COVID, but it really brought it to the forefront of our minds. So not just for people who are, were impacted by COVID, but for people who are generally been historically excluded from shaping the spaces that they actually occupy. What do you see as one of the most powerful ways, or some of the most powerful ways that placemaking can shape our well-being?
Well, thanks for the question. I think what's really transformative or potentially transformative about placemaking is when we persuade people that it's within their power to reimagine and reshape spaces. So I think of, for instance, neighborhoods, and I think COVID was an amazing period insofar as people really sought out spaces of connection or spaces where they could enjoy themselves and perhaps escape the challenges of the pandemic. And so if there was one thing that went well during the pandemic, it was that people seemed to feel empowered to rethink their environments and reshape them in ways that enabled them to engage in the type of activities they wanted to enjoy. And I think that illustrates very effectively how important placemaking is, that often we take for granted the spatial practices that are expected in certain spaces and don't think to either resist those or to reimagine them as ways that we can engage with our environment and with other people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that became evident during COVID, not to dwell on COVID, because I know most of us want to put it behind us, but there's there's some great lessons that came out of it. So I think it's worth putting a few fine points on it. I remember in Ontario versus Vancouver, Ontario had shut down a lot of the parks, whereas BC took a totally opposite approach where they're like, well, the parks are the only places we can go as a society. And I wonder if you were in your research, if you were able to see what came out of both of those decisions. Because very evidently, I believe the Ontarians revolted and then, and then the government changed their minds about it. But did you see anything specific about how the difference in even mandating how we occupy space drove people to actually say, create almost a right to be in public space and to reimagine that public space?
Yeah. Admittedly, I can't speak from a research perspective. That's not something that I examined closely, but I will say that through my own observations, that to be sure, I think people understood how important it was to find a space in which they could engage with others at a safe distance, because at the time, if you recall, we were engaging in physical distancing. But I think clearly, in retrospect, it was the wrong decision to close down public spaces. And I think if there were activities in which people needed to participate during the pandemic, it was to get outside, get some fresh air, to be physically active, but also I think to be socially connected with others. And earlier you talked about issues of social isolation and loneliness. I think that was very evident during the pandemic, but that continues to be a really enormous public health crisis that we experience now in this time, well after the pandemic. And so, if anything, the lessons we learned during the pandemic were how important these spaces were and are to all individuals. And so I think, at least during the pandemic, we talked a good talk about building back better. And my concern is that we've squandered those lessons. And it's amazing how people have reverted back to pre-pandemic perspectives about, oh, well, everything's fine. We don't need to make those extra investments. But I think it's only to our detriment if we fail to do so.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there's some of the lessons that were actually quite gainful lessons that came out of COVID that you're right. We seem to, I think it's just our habit as human beings to revert back to something that is, I suppose, comfortable, even if it's to our detriment, right? So I always hope that some of the lessons at least hold the line and we can, gradually, but you're right. There's a moment there where I think, oh, that's too bad that we didn't really lean into it and examine it a little bit more fulsomely.
Absolutely. If you look back, I mean, there were some amazing things that we did, whether it was the expansion of bike lanes or as I mentioned earlier, rethinking our neighborhoods as not just, or maybe in particular, reimagining streets as something more than just for cars. During the pandemic, people closed down their own streets, took it upon themselves to do so that people could play in those spaces. I think the whole perception of play is just really important in terms of our well-being, but also back to that crisis of social isolation and loneliness, putting us in positive contact with others and enabling us to interact with others in that healthy way.
Hmm. Your research talks about place attachment, and I think we're sort of delving in a little bit on that concept of our emotional and almost primal attachment to place, and the sense of a belonging really comes out of that feeling attached to a place and feeling ownership of that place. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that concept in the conversation we're talking about of creating places for people to claim their position, their sense of belonging as a community, because there's the individual happiness. But I think what we're trying to do at the Happitecture Podcast is talk about the larger impact of the like community well-being of the group happiness more so than the individual happiness.
I think place is a really important concept. And I think that when we start to unpack what it means, we start to appreciate how important it is to our well-being. So it's made up of a variety of dimensions. First of all, it's a location, but in addition to that, it's urban form, or not necessarily urban, but it's form, material form. But what's really important to place is also the interactions, or the meaning that's derived through interactions within that location and with that urban form. And what I think is really striking about that third dimension is that it really underscores the importance of our interactions with others, how that can help form our sense of place. So when it comes to our neighborhoods, for example, it's more than just that I live in Kitchener, I live in a particular neighborhood. My neighborhood looks a certain way. It's also the way that that space enables me to interact with other people. And through those interactions, I start to develop or at least build a sense of meaning about that space. So when it comes back to place making, that is really the importance of understanding how place works and enabling people to have those types of interactions that make a place meaningful to individuals.
So let's talk about the push and pull of the idea of placemaking. The idea that people within a community can claim their own space and make it so, and social capital, because that's always the tug of war, right? How do we facilitate citizens making their place versus the capital, the investment, all that stuff that really, without it, we are on the edges, really, in terms of creating space or demanding it in ways that are not really conducive to healthy communities. I know you've done some research on it, but I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on that tug of war and where that sweet spot is between placemaking and social capital.
Well, I think one of the challenges of community is that community is very beneficial insofar as it puts you in connection with other people. Typically, expands your social network upon which you can draw should you need any assistance. And I think that's what social capital ultimately is this idea of, as we invest in our relationships with others, we can kind of see a return on those investments through assistance where we need it, whether that means instrumental assistance, in other words getting ahead through the assistance I receive, or getting by, so people providing the social support that I need. Social capital is really fundamental to a healthy community, and I think placemaking is part of that process in terms of building an environment where people can interact in a positive way and build those connections, build healthy connections. I mean, certainly the flip side of that is that, as if your environment exposes you to negative relationships, then that will have sort of a detrimental effect on terms of your health and well-being. So I think social connections are very much a social determinant of our health and well-being. And I think placemaking plays an important role in that.
Yeah, I actually read a research document about a year and a half ago, and they were saying that the health outcomes, when you measure it, of someone most likely to have heart disease is actually the measurement of how many close friends and community they have is actually a better measurement of their health outcome.
I would encourage your listeners to check out a recent book. It's from 2023, but it was called The Good Life, and it was by Waldinger and Schultz, who were Harvard professors who have worked on the Harvard Adult Development Study. And that's the longest longitudinal study on people's health and well-being. And their ultimate finding from that research is that the most important thing we can do for our health and well-being is cultivate relationships, warm relationships of all kinds. That's the best thing we can do for our health. And what's amazing is, in the past decade or so, we've seen this overwhelming evidence about the importance of positive social connections in our lives. I think that people tend to take those connections for granted. We don't think about how important that is. We know that we need to exercise. We know we need to eat well. We need to get sleep. But I don't think, in that list, people think of social connectedness as being perhaps even more important than those other things when it comes to our mortality and risk of morbidity.
Yes. No, I'm really glad you mentioned the actual study because I believe that's, one of the most, well, certainly more recent studies and probably one of the most comprehensive because of its length of time that they followed the same group of people. And I'm glad you mentioned it. I think we'll put it in the notes because I think it's really worth exploring and considering, certainly when we think about creating public space and creating places. It's not just because it's fun and nice. And I actually think there's a health outcome here that is fairly well researched and well documented now. The impetus becomes even more urgent for us, especially in these times, to consider public space as a health benefit.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the 2023 report from the US Surgeon General,
That's right.
where the Surgeon General declared that social isolation and loneliness is an epidemic in the United States. And I think it's fair to say that that's no different in Canada, even though we've had largely silence on the Canadian side. But this is a major public health crisis. And interestingly, in the Surgeon General's report, he identifies social infrastructure as one of the most important things that we can do in terms of addressing this challenge. So, ultimately, social infrastructure gets at those places and spaces that afford connection, that put people into contact with one another.
Yeah. I think, when we talk about placemaking, there's a certain degree of placemaking is an action item, right? It's not, yes, there needs to be infrastructure. Yes, there needs to be investment, but the act of placemaking is an action. It's a verb. And I wonder if you could talk about that specific action, both from a municipality point of view, but from an average citizen. What's the responsibility on both sides of the scale here? Talk about activating public space.
Well, I'll start by saying that, I think the realm of architecture is really important in terms of, building that material form that puts people into contact with one another, encourages connection. But I think that one of the challenges is that we tend to build things and then sort of assume that they're just going to flourish.
Yes, guilty.
Yeah. And I think the reality is that we really need to think a lot about continuous placemaking. And that kind of gets to the point that you're making in terms of activating spaces. It's a deliberate effort to enliven spaces in ways that make those spaces relevant to the people who use them or people who could use them. That's just really important, to get the fullest out of these spaces over time. And so I think, what can municipalities do? What can individuals do? Well, along with a colleague from Brock, Aaron Sharp, and I, we wrote a piece called Playing in the City. And we distinguish between the idea of playing in the city, which we saw as a top down approach where municipalities start to program spaces to engage residents, inhabitants. But there's also playing with the city, which is more of a tactical urbanist type perspective where, again, we're encouraging people to reimagine their spaces and think about what they can do from a bottom up approach. So I think those two approaches are really fundamental. And, as we talk about social isolation, loneliness, there's also perhaps an introduction of a third approach, which will be playing as a city.
Oh,
So, what can we do where we engage, engage in activity that gives us that connection, that sense of belonging to something bigger than just my intimate relationships or my relationships with acquaintances. Like what can build those connections to a larger identity where I feel like I'm a member of this community, I'm a member of this neighborhood. And I think all of those things are really important.
for the benefit of our guests who are not in the planning and design communities, can you help us define the word programming? Because I don't know that many of our listeners would understand that term.
Well, I'll acknowledge that I'm a professor in recreation and leisure studies. And so when it comes to programming, where I come from is the idea of really programming spaces so that you are injecting some sort of recreation or leisure in that context, which encourages people to interact with one another. So it's really the way that we try to make spaces special and relevant.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. As an architect, I could say I agree with that. I mean, it's just how you use the space and how you divvy up different types of spaces for a variety and a diverse group, diverse use, essentially. I just thought it was worth describing that a little bit. So I mean, one of the things that are challenging, that could be challenging, is this gap between municipal design, urban design, architecture design, and the public's input in placemaking. And I was really intrigued by a part of your research called the third space. And the reason I'm intrigued about that is because in architecture, we call it the threshold. And lots of amazing things happen in the threshold, magical things, actually. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about the power of the third space and how ordinary citizens can actually claim that space for themselves to even push back on negative impacts of the built environment and sort of recreate. So, I mean, let's face it, we've made some mistakes urbanistically, but I think there is some opportunity in this third space you talk about to start to push back out on those negative urban spaces and reclaim the third space and use that as the catalyst to reimagine the rest of the space. So I'm really intrigued about your third space theory, and I'd love to get into it.
For those, I guess, academic nerds out there who are listening, there is a distinction between something called third place and third space. And just so that we're very clear on what we're talking about third space. Third place, generally, people think of that as not home, not work or school, but a third place, which is community. But we're talking about something called third space, which I can't take credit for that concept, but Edward Soha, as I recall, coined that term, and it's premised upon Henri Lefebvre's spatial triad. So Lefebvre was a Marxist philosopher, and he argued that space is often it's often positioned as something that is objective, like it's a set of coordinates. It's just it lacks meaning. But from his perspective, he was making the argument that space is actually produced, that we produce it through a variety of moments that exist. And so I'm sorry for the long description, but I'm going to
No,
get
that's
at
great.
third space. Basically, he developed something that was very useful, which we refer to as a spatial triad. And it's these three things that come together as moments to produce space. The first part of the triad is conceived space. And this is the realm of architects and planners. And we conceive a space to be a certain thing. So, through blueprints, through planning, through, architectural design, this is how they are designed, these spaces. And then spaces are perceived. So from that perspective, when users go to use those spaces, we kind of have this impression that there's a certain use that is prescribed to that space. So, if I go to a public square, I might sort of assume that it's a place where I can congregate with other residents or people, and there's a certain prescribed behavior that is acceptable within that space. And then the third dimension of the spatial triad is what Lefebvre called lived space. And this is really that third space that you're referring to. It's got the most potential in terms of resisting the way that spaces are conceived and the way that they're perceived, because people will use spaces in ways that they weren't designed for, or that users aren't sort of expected to use them in a certain way. So, back to your point about third space, there's this what we might call emancipatory potential, where people can appropriate space. They can use it for their own purposes or rethink ways that it's being used so that it becomes more meaningful to them and to maybe the groups to which they belong.
Can you give us an example of what that could be, like in our current context?
Yeah, I think, for example, if I go back to the example of a public space that, say, a municipal government has built and manages, often, it's conceived in a certain way. So, it's designed maybe to encourage interaction, but a certain type of interaction. And when people visit these spaces, maybe they understand, well, they're allowed to sit and, have a coffee and take in the atmosphere. That's acceptable. But then it's quite conceivable that also people may resist that. So skateboarders are a great example where they start using the space in ways that you didn't intend. Seated area in that space maybe was meant for sitting, but a skateboarder would view it as a great ledge, to use in skateboarding on that property. And they recognizing that maybe they aren't even allowed to be in that space, but do so anyway. So, again, that third space concept is the notion that there's room for resistance, that people can use spaces in ways that we never really expected them to do so. And sometimes that is welcome, and sometimes that's unwelcome. But nevertheless, people do use spaces in ways that we never really conceived them to be used.
Yeah. Have you ever seen an example where that resistive action that becomes more integrated into what then you would call a third space?
I think this is where the idea of tactical urbanism has played a big role. And so tactical urbanism refers to that bottom up approach where residents or inhabitants of a community take it upon themselves to alter the environment to suit their purposes. And so we'll see things like, for instance, there was a famous case in Hamilton where residents for years were saying this intersection was really dangerous and it needed to be pushed out a bit so that pedestrians would be safer. And what they found was that the city was not responding to their calls for changes to that environment. So eventually they just said, you know what, we're just going to do it ourselves. So a group of neighbors got together and basically grabbed some pylons, pushed out the curb at the intersection. I think they used some paint, to make it look like it was pushed out. And so what happened was because they took it upon themselves, eventually the city was like, we got to do something. We need to act on this. We can't let these individuals do that themselves. We're going to push it out. It led to change in terms of the residents' original request being answered by the city. So that's a small example. You were asking more for a question about where it can turn into a community, a sense of community, or a third place, like you said.
Yes, but I mean, I love that example because it shows a small community action can really change the physical environment.
I think kids are great at this. Like I remember growing up, I grew up in Burlington in Southern Ontario, and I remember there was this place, like it's a property that hadn't been developed on a street close to the school I went to. And the kids at the time, BMX bikes was really popular activity. And a bunch of kids from my neighborhood took it upon themselves to make like basically a track on this property. So they don't own the property. They took it upon themselves to build this trail, which we called the Belvinia Trails. That was the name of the street it was on. And we would go there after schools. We'd ride our bikes. It became like a hangout spot. So a good example, that's an excellent example of, it became a third place. When we weren't home and we weren't at school, we were hanging out at Belvinia Trails. Now, eventually, I mentioned earlier that these things are sometimes welcome and sometimes they're unwelcome. And of course, not surprisingly, the developer was like, what's going on with this? This is my property. And eventually put up some fences and kept kids from being part of it. But that is an excellent example of a third space in terms of, we took an existing space and appropriated it in a certain way.
Yeah. So would you say that this was the impetus for your work, perhaps?
Perhaps. I mean, I often think about that example, and I remember actually at the time, I remember a bunch of adults, our parents, bemoaning the fact that this developer closed down that site because, it was something that we as youth had created, and it was a very positive space. But, like, understandably, it wasn't our space to use, even though we did so.
Yeah. But I think even an act like that, even if it's temporary, there's something about creating that place that you talk about, this third place, that is a powerful glue, social glue and community glue. That even in that moment, and I mean, who can know why we do what we do when we're adults? But let's. I think those formative moments, the feeling of empowerment of the places that you grew up in and that you created on your own, I think those things have a very powerful impact, and sometimes they show up in ways like being the professor of leisure and recreation,
Right,
studying
yeah.
public space and the third place, right? Who knows?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to youth, they have so much imagination when it comes
Yes.
to these
Yeah.
things. I don't think they're as reserved about, the notion that there's, this private space. I think we as adults could learn a lot from that in terms
Yes.
of rethinking our environment around us.
So let's go back to the theory of all this. What makes a good amazing, powerful third place? What are the ingredients that one needs to think about? Is it that triad we talked about? Is it something else? Is it a constant activation? What is it that makes that third place?
That's a great question. I think that a space that works well, that becomes a place, because with space in some ways is really what Lefebvre said is kind of an objective space. He railed against that, but generally when we think of a space, it lacks that meaning.
Yes, it's a canvas.
Right, it's the canvas, yeah, that's a great, metaphor, and, as we interact with one another, I think if we color that canvas, we paint that canvas, and it can become a beautiful thing. So I think it's the encouragement of engaging with this space, engaging with others, and I think that's really important, is that when we think about our lives right now, I think that's a missing dimension for many of us. When we talked about the crisis of isolation and loneliness, I think we're so focused on convenience in this contemporary moment that, like when it comes to, if we think about, our living situations, where we tend to be, I guess, isolated at home with our entertainment and, convenient entertainment, or we don't think about going into public as much. People are hanging out less. So these spaces become so important in terms of drawing people to hang out. So what is important is to provide people with that nudge, right? So when it comes to activating a public space or any space, it's really all about nudging people to engage with other people in meaningful and positive ways. So whatever we can do to design a space and also program a space to give people those nudges, the more, I think, healthier our communities will be.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about designing the space because of course as an architect it's hard for me to not think about design of space. And the work that we do at Cora, or I do at Cora, is one of the things we're championing is this sort of community-led design effort where the idea that the design comes from the figurehead, the top, and everyone else gets to just exist in someone else's imagination. We're I wouldn't say we're railing against it because there's a time and place for that, but we're really encouraging that community engagement in order to use as design inputs for us to then design. Do you see a major role in that kind of approach in creating public spaces, creating placemaking, let's say placemaking? Or is there still a significant role for that sort of top down approach? And then we get to activate it by building a trail through the property, or skateboarding on the benches.
Yeah, no, I think incorporating the voices of those people who potentially are going to use the space is really important in terms of the space's success. If we, throughout this conversation, I've talked about how important it is for spaces to be relevant, to be meaningful. And it's very challenging for us to create relevant and meaningful spaces if we're not engaging with those people who potentially could use it or who we potentially want to use it. So, there are lots of groups within our communities who may not have access to space or may not be attracted to a space. And perhaps that's because of more of a top down approach where we just assume that this is the way that we connect people, this is the way that we engage people. And without hearing from those folks, we're going to continue to, I guess, isolate them, to discourage them from using these spaces. So I think that a notion of the voices of potential users is really fundamental to successful placemaking.
Hmm. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's what we try to do at Cora for sure. In the Happitecture podcast is that sort of providing that dialogue and that conversation to the general public to empower the general public to take agency. But I also think that a lot of times communities feel that that process takes too long or that process is inefficient. And so there's this battle between this idea of efficiency and creating a space, which I would say doesn't always equal place in the end if we look at efficiency as a very strong denominator in our decision making process for creating space. But I was hoping to get your take on that, and I appreciate your angle on it because I think the conversation we need to start having, not just at City Hall, not just in the drawing rooms of the studios of architects, but as community, is how do we as citizens engage with the people who are making the spaces and offering and and insisting that we have a seat at the table.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's just really important. And the reality is that you're talking about democracy in many ways, and democracy is inefficient, but it's important in terms of making people feel a sense of ownership over the space that's being designed. As I said before, this notion of designing is important. Also, that programming piece, if people feel connected to the process of it being designed, they can
Yes.
also take that ownership over the space and be empowered to program that space themselves, which I think is really important.
I think that's hugely important because I think the disconnect is what gets the pieces of the puzzle missing, right? When you don't feel you can have a say, your sense of belonging, the social contract is broken because your sense of belonging is removed from that process. I think we just create, like you say, we just create the same spaces that don't activate, don't nurture, don't heal, don't create strong and resilient communities. And so I hope whoever's listened to this realize that they have a lot of agency in creating the space, co-creating spaces with designers, with planners, with policymakers even. I think this is a group effort, really. And I would love to see people engage more with those planners, with those designers, and become a part of that creation process.
Agreed. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the future of placemaking, because we've learned a lot of lessons up until now. Technology plays a huge role in how we go about our everyday lives. I wonder if there's a place for technology in placemaking, or is place an opportunity to disconnect? What are your thoughts on that?
I suspect it's somewhat complex in terms of it's not one or the other, but probably both, and at different times, one or the other, at times both combined. But I think there is obviously an important role for public spaces in this day and age of ubiquitous connection online to engage in person, have those face to face interactions, and perhaps just have a break from those sorts of technologies. I can also appreciate how technologies, you were talking about engaging publics around designing spaces, rethinking spaces. I mean, there's a role for technology in terms of engaging other people to rethink spaces. I suspect that I haven't done a lot of work in the area of augmented reality, but, like even in terms of placemaking efforts, there are ways I'm sure that you could incorporate technology to enhance the experience in place. So I think there's lots of opportunities there that we're going to flesh out further, as we move forward.
This is probably your next research topic, no?
Maybe, yeah.
We're unfortunately, I mean, we could talk more, but unfortunately, we are getting to the end. But let's take a 5 to 10 year look ahead. What sort of shifts? And then we're going to come back to the immediate because we always end with what can we take immediate action and to improve our public space. But let's take a long term vision. What do we need to shift now so that in the next 5 to 10 years, we have better places, amazingly powerful third places, and a mechanism for human and community engagement that really starts to counter the loneliness epidemic that we're facing as a society. And I suspect it's all over, not just North America, but in lots of different places around the world. What should we shift between now or what do we need to shift?
Well, getting back to our earlier points around lessons from the pandemic, I think that we need to take the lesson that we learned around the importance of these spaces and commit to investment in them and the expansion of their availability in our communities. I think that was just really underscored during the pandemic, how important these spaces were and are. And I think that to some extent we've relapsed to pre-pandemic perspectives in terms of our investment around these spaces. And yet there's serious urgency around ensuring that we have those spaces secured and invested in, especially as we work toward, currently in Canada and elsewhere, there's an affordability crisis when it comes to housing. And my fear is that I understand the importance of prioritizing building homes, but my fear is that that's going to be undertaken at the expense of thinking through what those communities are going to look like in the future. If we don't invest in social infrastructure, in public spaces, in spaces where people can connect within their neighborhoods, what kind of neighborhoods are those going to be, and why would anybody want to live there, other
Yes.
than it being affordable at the time? We don't want to look ahead 30 years and think, this neighborhood was really poorly designed because it doesn't have spaces where we can go to connect. So I think there's some urgency around making sure that we make those investments in these types of spaces.
Well, I mean, if you talk about housing, I think there's such a great opportunity when we think about working from home and that sort of hybrid work environment. I think we have to rethink how we even design housing. And then those public spaces become really key in supporting that new culture of work where you work from home in a tiny apartment. You need those expansion spaces in order to interact and connect and even just disconnect. You know what I mean? And so I think, yes, we can prioritize housing, but I also think housing needs to be rethought as a part of the puzzle, not just the big piece in the middle that everything else sort of, gets designed around.
Absolutely. And I think, I've been working closely with a colleague in Waterloo named Paul Cobflesh. He wrote a book called The Joy Experiments, which I think your listeners would be really interested in. But in my conversations with him, and he hasn't written about this idea, but I'm urging him to do so, he talks about the three dimensions of life, in terms of live, work, and play. And in this contemporary moment, to your point around our living situation, our work situation in terms of our work being remote, our with this affordability crisis, people are not necessarily going to be able to afford single detached homes, and so the meaning of home is changing a lot. So that dimension of play becomes really crucial, and it becomes a strategic opportunity for us to think about, well, where do we ensure that people have meaningful experiences in their communities? If their living circumstances and their work situations are not putting them into contact with people as much as as it did in the past, then it just underscores more emphatically how important these play spaces, or the public spaces, the social infrastructure are in terms of our day-to-day living.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more. And what I don't design housing, but I hope that my colleagues out there who do design housing are listening to this conversation, because I think there is an opportunity here for something pretty amazing, and using the built environment to really heal and nurture, as your research is on specifically on patients recovering from cancer. But let's think about it for everyone. There's a huge opportunity here, and I hope we get to see it in our lifetime.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I think there's good designers like you and others who I think are really thinking about these issues.
Yes.
So
Hopefully they're encouraged by this conversation.
I hope so.
And then finally, to our last point, how do we as individuals create that, start making a difference in our own neighborhood in small ways, to really push back on the idea that space is created and then everyone walks away? How do we as individuals create place in our neighborhoods, in our communities, on our streets, or even form groups that can lobby for better public space? What are some of the actions we can take in the immediate?
I think we all have to see ourselves as placemakers. I think that we have a tendency to think of architects and planners as being chiefly situated in terms of engaging in placemaking, but I think that we as everyday inhabitants of a community need to think about we have that role as placemakers in our own neighborhoods.
I love
And I
that.
think that's very empowering insofar as it enables us to think, hey, like this sidewalk, it's not just for walking on. Maybe there are other uses for it. Likewise, the street, what could we do with the street? It's not just for cars, it's for people. So what does that look like? Rethinking the way that we even use our own properties. We tend to privatize a lot of our activities in our backyards. Well, why not in the front yards? There's an excellent example in Winnipeg of a number of neighbors in this one neighborhood where they use all of their front yards to create this enormous skating rink. It's in the front yard, and the whole community is invited to use that area. So when we talk about social connectedness, that's a great effort, collective effort by residents themselves to put people into contact and create a greater sense of community and connectedness where they live. So I think the more that we think of ourselves as placemakers, I think there's greater potential for us to not only improve our own health and well-being, but the health and well-being of our neighbors, our community members, and others.
That's an amazing place to wrap this. Thank you so much for that. I think you're right. We don't all often think of ourselves as placemakers, or even that we have the agency to be placemakers. So that's a beautiful sentiment. I thank you for that. And I thank you for being here with us at the Happitecture Podcast. And I look forward to your newest research. Do you have anything that you're working on right now that we should look forward to?
I just wrapped up a study on neighborhood walking and social connectedness. So the idea of people seeing social connection as very much part of their joy of walking in their neighborhoods. But I also have a study underway that's looking at privately owned public spaces, so POPs, the way that they're conceived and perceived and lived as, like spaces of social connection.
Amazing. We will look forward to that.
Thank you. Yeah. But thank you very much. It's a wonderful conversation.
It was a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you being on the podcast. And I really appreciate it's really a beautiful conversation to have. I think when we think about place, there's something so powerful and personal about it. And I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.
For more information on this or any other episodes of the Happitecture Podcast, you can find us at happitecture.com. happitecture.com. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Happitecture Podcast. Thanks to our sponsor, Cora Architecture and Interiors, creating spaces for your well-being. The Happitecture Podcast is produced by Janessa Klatt.